Okay, the questions on page 257, content questions. These were to have been written in complete sentences except for the ones where you were listening. So when I call on you, read your answer, and that should give us the question as well. All right, so we were doing all of them, I believe. Yes, all the content questions. Number 1, read that for us, Alex.
The business of fur trapping and trading attracted the British to Oregon.
That is correct. Make sure everyone's speaking very loudly so that it can be picked up by our microphone. So the fur trade is the answer there. Any question? All right, read number 2 for us. Haley?
Secretary of State Daniel Webster did not resign.
Resign.
Resign, sorry. With Tyler's cabinet because the ongoing
Negotiations
Yeah.
with Great Britain, right, exactly. Because he was in the process of negotiating with Great Britain over the disputed boundary of Maine. And so he felt it was not a good idea to leave in the midst of that. Any question? All right, number 3, you needed to put them in the proper chronological order along with their dates. So I think this is what we're going to do with this one. This could be difficult. We're going to count it a point each for having the correct date. And then it'll be another point if they're all in the right order. So whether you have 1 out of order or 2 out of order, we're not going to try to mess with that. If they're out of order at all, it'll be 1 point off. All right, so I'm just going to give you the dates on this. That'll be the easiest thing to do. So, and I'll give it, it's going to be in the right order too. So I'm going to give it to you. Then I'll go back over it again. C, the Maine boundary settlement was 1842. B, the annexation of Texas was 1845. E, the Oregon boundary settlement was 1846. A, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was 1848. And D, the Gadsden Purchase was 1853. So those are the dates. The proper order then would have been C, B, E, A, D. Any question on how to grade that? You get a point for each. Count each date. If you missed a date, count that a point off. And then if the order is not exactly as I gave it, that's a point off. Michaela.
What did you have for the annexation of Texas?
That is 1845. Any others? All right, let's go to number 4. Read that for us. Sophia.
The question and my answer.
Your answer should include the question.
Okay. The Santa Fe Trail differs from the other 2 stated because it was more of a commercial route than the one for the pioneers.
Right, exactly. So the Oregon and Mormon trails were for settlers. The Santa Fe Trail was more for transporting goods. Any question? All right, read number 5 for us. Joey.
Zachary Taylor was more popular than Winfield Scott, but Winfield Scott was America's greatest commander of the Mexican War and had more strategic ability.
Very good. You include a lot of information there. 2 points, 1 for naming Taylor first and then for naming Scott second. Any question? All right, read number 6 for us. Sally.
The Polk administration entrusted the New Mexico campaign to Winfield Scott instead of Zachary Taylor because Polk wanted to prevent Taylor from receiving more glory.
Why? There's something more to it than that. Why didn't he want Taylor to receive more glory? Does anybody have the additional part of this answer? He just didn't like Taylor. Why wouldn't he want him to receive more glory? Steph?
It has, since the late, since it wants to Taylor for president, the Polk administration decided not to give any more opportunities for Taylor.
Exactly, because Taylor was gonna be running for president. And Polk didn't want to give him more opportunities to get more glory, to get more acclamation, to give him a greater popularity when he's running for president. Michaela?
Well, it said in the book that one of the reasons they gave it to him was because he was better strategic, he was better strategist. So,
No, I don't think it does say that. Read the entire sentence. I don't have the text in front of me. I think I better get mine. At the bottom of page 254, it says that Scott had a better grasp of strategy, however, and his Mexican, let's see, that's not.
it says, the administration assigned this task to General Winfield Scott, probably the most capable commander. But old fuss and butters because of his less than military pomp and discipline, Scott lacked the warmth of Taylor and was not popular with the rank and file. A better grasp of strategy, however, and his Mexican campaign was one of the most brilliant in American military history.
Yeah, that's the end result of Scott. Oh, here it is, page 253. Page 253, the first full paragraph. Taylor had won a great victory, but several factors worked to undermine his position. Defeat in Monterrey was not enough to force the Mexican government in far of Mexico City to make peace. In the meantime, so many Whigs were speaking of running Old Rough and Ready for president that the Democratic administration resolved to give him no more opportunities for glory. A planned thrust on Mexico City was instead entrusted to Winfield Scott, Taylor's superior. Scott soon took the best of his men, and the rest of it just talks about the campaign. So that's where it is talking about the one who was given the position. I think the sentences which talk about Scott's success are looking back at what he did, not why he was given the position to begin with. The question is, why did the Polk administration give the campaign to Scott instead of Zachary Taylor? So looking back, yeah, Scott was the better commander and all that, but the reason they gave it to him instead of Taylor is because of what it says back on page 253, that he was possibly running for president and they didn't want to give him any more opportunities. All right, any other questions about that one? Yeah.
On 254, at the bottom, it says the administration assigned a task to Winfield Scott because he was their most capable commander.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't say that that's why they awarded him, it says he probably was the most capable commander. You know, they kind of stumbled into getting a good guy there. Again, it says, the administration assigned this task to General Winfield Scott, probably their most capable commander. That's a judgment of history looking back on him and saying he probably was their most capable commander, but that's not why they gave it to him. And then goes on to talk about the difference between Scott and Taylor. The reason they gave him the command was much earlier than when he actually was leading this campaign in central Mexico. And that's back on page 253, where it says that they took the position away from Taylor because of his possibly running for president. And it was instead given to Winfield Scott. So by the time you get to what you're looking at on page 254, he's already been given the position, and in retrospect, it turned out that he did a good job. That's basically what it's saying. But that's not the reason the poll gave it to him to begin with. He didn't foresee, oh yeah, Scott will do a much better job. Didn't know that ahead of time. He gave it to him because he didn't want Taylor to get any more glory running, as he's going to be running against him for president.
So we're going off that wrong.
Well, if you didn't have the right answer, it's wrong, yeah. That's usually how it works, isn't it?
Badly worded question. Mistake of the book writer.
All right, how many of you had that that Scott was given the position instead of Taylor basically because of Taylor was going to be running for president? Okay, we have one scholar amongst you. Yeah, yours was partially there. Yeah, I would take half on yours because you were on the right road. You just didn't arrive at the destination. Yeah. No. The joy is getting there. All right, next one, number 8. This one was basically listing name the campaign that is described by the following phrases. So A difficult march with no hard fighting. Which one is that? Megan. New Mexico is correct. B, commanded by Zachary Taylor. Sarah. Northern Mexico. C, commanded by Winfield Scott. Jill. Correct. Central Mexico. D, led in part by the Pathfinder of the West. Nate.
California.
Correct. E, Battle of Buena Vista. Let's see. Brady.
Northern Mexico.
Correct. F, the Bear Flag Republic. Alex.
California.
Correct. California. G, the Siege of Veracruz. Lahana.
Central Mexico.
Correct. And H, Stephen Kearny's first campaign. Hayden.
New Mexico.
Correct. All right, point for each of those. And that gives us a total of 20 points. So put the number of points you have off at the top and circle it. And pass them to Brady, and Brady will put them on my desk.
Yeah.
So it's 2 for 1, yes, it's just 1.
All right, you need to open your notebooks to a place where you have some blank paper. So take some notes. We're going to, in a run up to what's called the American Civil War, look at the issue of slavery. So we want to learn some things about slavery, Probably some things that you've not heard before, perspective maybe you've not heard before. So we'll look at the facts about slavery. There is an assignment for you to do for tomorrow. That is to go back on page 218 and 219, reread the box on slavery. Many of you probably skipped it anyway. So go back and read that box on slavery. On 224, 225, there's a section on abolition. Read that. Read on page 226, slavery in the churches. And then, let's see, you do not have the next article probably, because I'm not giving you any notes. So I'll give that to you tomorrow. Slave songs. The next day we have school. All right, so let's look at slavery. First of all, making slaves. Where did slaves come from? From where did they come? When we're talking about slavery in the United States, they came primarily from Africa. How did people become slaves to begin with? I can tell if you're laughing or laughing or both. How did they become slaves?
Like Indian wars, and then the opposing tribes would like sell their African.
It would be Indian. African, you mean, that's what you meant, right? Yeah, African wars. So people became slaves by Africans enslaving other Africans. That's where it begins. And then some of them discovered that Europeans were willing to buy slaves. But it starts with Africans enslaving Africans, as you can see here. These are slaves, and Africans are pushing along the line, as you see here. Here's an African chieftain, and slaves being brought before him. Now, the part of Africa where slavery was greatest was along the West African coast, and it's not real clear for some reason. In fact, some of it was called the Slave Coast, but these are cities that were ports from which most of the African slaves were taken. So European ships would come into these ports and buy slaves from the local African slave traders who had gotten them from the interior of Africa, buying them from African tribes who enslaved other African tribes. Some of them would even go out looking for people to enslave. So, hide in the bushes somewhere, and you see a person walking by that might make a good slave, and you capture him, kidnap him. But it starts with Africans enslaving Africans and then selling them to Europeans. And then here's the direction they went from here. So this is the area from which most of the slaves came, or at least where they were sold, some on the eastern side too. And the arrows show you where they went. So quite a few of them are coming into ports in South America. Some are coming into Central America. And then some are coming into North America in these places. In addition, slaves were being brought up into Europe, a couple places here. And then quite a few slaves are being taken across Africa, Northern Africa, into the area where the Arabs are in control, where the Muslims are in control. All right, any questions so far? Slaves became part of what's called the triangle trade. So, very simplified, you have manufactured goods being produced in Europe and being sent to Africa, also being sent to North America and others. Slaves being picked up and brought to the West Indies or places in North America, South America. And then the raw materials that are produced here, sugar, cotton, tobacco, and that would include up in North America as well, being sent to Europe. Manufactured goods being produced. And so there was this basic triangle of trade. Very simplified to look at it that way, but that's essentially what was happening with the trade. So when we think about the slave trade, there's some very gruesome pictures that come to us, drawings. These are just how crowded conditions were on the boat. This is on the upper deck of the boat, but that's not where they spent most of their time. This is just bringing them up to get a little fresh air. They were put down in the hold. So slaves were forced to go down into the lower deck of the boat and were crowded together for the transatlantic crossing. This is a very famous drawing of how they were arranged. You see, this just looks like maybe a lot of black blob or something here, but these are individual people, and we'll get a closer look later. Just stacked in rows on slabs of wood. Shelves, I guess, would be a good word for it. Here we have a drawing of the lower deck. This is a closer look. You can see, maybe easier to see here, these are, you can see the heads, individual people, side by side, all the way around. Men would be over on this side, boys in the middle, and women on this side. And then there would be another layer of people, you know, even individual spaces like that, just beside one another. Now, we talked about what it was like for the pilgrims to come across the Atlantic Ocean. The first time many of them had been on the ocean. Most of these people had never even seen the ocean, let alone been on the ocean, let alone been on a boat. So you can imagine what the conditions were like for them. But they can't throw up into a bucket or go up on the deck and throw up overboard. They're doing it right there where they're laying. If they have to go to the bathroom, they do it right there. And if there are people, I can't remember which ones, it's to say, that's the lower deck. So if they're up here and go to the bathroom, whatever, it goes down on the people that are down below them. And there's nothing you can do about it. They're just stacked in there, like sardines, as you might say. A terrible condition. We're brought up periodically for a little exercise, and I give it some food, and so on. But many, many people died on the crossing itself. And to make matters even worse, you can't even talk to the person next to you, quite possibly, because they're from all different tribes, and the people around you may not even speak the same language. And little consolation of any kind. You're there in the dark for however long it takes to go across the ocean. Weeks, certainly. Terrible, terrible situation. Let's talk about the numbers. There were between 10 and 28 million people taken from Africa in the slave trade. Obviously, it's impossible to get exact figures. 17 million, it is thought, were sold into slavery on the coast of the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and North Africa. So that's going the other direction. 12 million to America. So although, you know, because in this country we're concerned with the slaves that were here, that's mostly what we think about. But that number, the number of slaves brought to the Americas, North and South America, is lower than the amount of slaves that were taken up into North Africa and to the east coast of Africa. 5 million were taken across the Sahara, West Africa, into slavery in other parts of the world. So this gives us a little broader picture of slavery. Slavery was a worldwide event. It was something that was not limited to the United States. In fact, the United States is a very small part of what was going on with slavery at the time, African slavery. This shows you the different European countries that were involved and how much. It's difficult to tell the colors on here, but the Spanish Empire, it goes in order, I think. So the Spanish Empire, you can see, is here. The French West Indies. Look at Brazil. Brazil had a lot of slaves. And of course, that's run by the Portuguese. The British West Indies, Dutch West Indies, Europe, very small amount comparatively, and then British North America. So although this is what we're concerned with, the slavery in the United States, when you look at the number of slaves that came here versus slaves in other parts of the Americas, is a very small percentage in comparison. The majority of the slaves brought to the New World were to Spanish, French, and Portuguese colonies, not to the English colonies or to America, to United States colonies. Now, another part of the slave trade that we ought to be aware of is the Islamic slave trade. Some interesting facts we know. Of course, these are the slaves that are being taken this direction and this direction over to this area. They're being sent to the Arab world, to the Muslim world. They took 2 women for every man. Now, if you think back on the ship, were there more men or women on that ship? Men, a lot more men. Why would it be more conducive to bring male slaves to the Americas than female slaves?
Do the work. To do the work.
To do the work. Hey, you're bringing slaves to do work in the fields, to work at cutting trees, whatever you're doing, rubber plantations, sugar plantations, you need workers, and so you get predominantly males. But look at what the Arabs are doing. They're getting 2 women for every man. So what does that tell you about their purpose for slaves? Are they predominantly buying slaves to do work, at least to work in fields, things like that? No. What are they buying them for? Predominantly. Sex. Same thing they're doing today. They haven't stopped, and maybe not in a grand scale, but they're still doing it today. The death in transit was 80 to 90%. So if you're a slave, captured as a slave, and you've got a choice, which you don't, you'd much rather be sent to America than with the Arabs, because it's very likely you're going to die if you go with the Arabs. And they were destined for sexual exploitation, the males for military service. They had forced them to be a soldier. Again, they're doing the same thing today. If you read about what's going on in Africa today, with in some of the countries, there are Muslim generals who are capturing children, forcing their children to kill their parents, and then forcing them to join the army, and they teach them to kill, and to be part, and they can't get out. They're not willing participants, but they are participants. Going on today. It hasn't changed. Very few descendants of the slaves that ended up in the Middle East survived. You know, if you look in America today, in the United States, you can see a lot of the descendants of slave survivors, right? But you don't see that in the Arab world. Why? Well, most of the male slaves were castrated. They didn't want them to produce any children. And most of the children born to the women were killed. So in the United States, for example, if slaves had children, you know, some plantation owners would look at that as, okay, I've got some free slaves here. I've got more slaves. And sometimes slaves were even bred for that purpose. But not in the Arab world. In the Muslim world, they didn't want them having any children. They castrated the men and killed any babies that were born. Any comments or questions? All right, let's then begin to center on slavery in America. And by that I'm talking about the United States, not all the Americas. The Middle Passage, that is the passage on ship between Africa and America, usually took about 4 to 9 weeks. So a month to a couple of months. And unlike the 80 to 90% death rate, if you were taken into the Muslim world, in the American Middle Passage, about 8 to 10% died, which is still not great, but certainly better than 9. I mean, it's the opposite. 10% survived if you're taken into Arab slavery. 10% died taken to European slavery. Now, that sounds bad. We say that's awful that 8 to 10% of the slaves on the ships died before they got here. Everybody would agree that's terrible, and I've heard a lot made of that. But what I didn't know until just a year or two ago is the death rate for the crews on those ships was exactly the same. And you even wonder how, with those people being crammed in like that there weren't a higher percentage. But the crews died at the same rate of 8 to 10% on the way over. So I'm not sure what the explanation of that is. Of course, one's being forced and the other one's not, although some crew members were not serving voluntarily on ships either. They were sometimes kidnapped. All right, so we look at what's called the peculiar institution. Slavery was a curious enigma in a country dedicated to freedom, and that is continued to be a topic of discussion to this day. It withered and died by 1800 in most of the northern states for 2 reasons. Well, let me ask you, why do you think slavery withered and died in the northern states by 1800? What's the reason for that? Any ideas? Caleb?
They didn't have plantations with farms. So
But they had farms, right?
yeah, just not as big, and they didn't produce cotton.
Okay. So they weren't as big. So if you don't have large farms, it's not really conducive to having slaves. It's not as a profitable thing to do. And so the one reason that's given often is that it was repulsive. But I would say that's not the number one reason. I think that's a subsidiary reason. The real reason is that it was of no benefit economically, which is what Caleb was saying. Now, I would contend, I think for good reason, that if it was not for this, that wouldn't have been a reason either. In other words, it's easy to be repulsed by something which does not benefit you, but it does benefit somebody else. So, in a way, I'm saying that many Northerners were rather hypocritical in criticizing the South for the use of slavery, because the North really couldn't use slaves that much. And so it's easy to say how awful it is if you're not doing it, if you don't need to do it, or if it's not advantageous to you to do it. Now, one reason why I can say that, I think, and of course not all Northerners, when I'm talking in generalities, but who was it that brought the slaves to the South? Northern merchants. It was Northerners who brought the slaves to the South to begin with, and then later on, Northerners would be the ones to say how bad the South was for having slaves. Well, who made the money off of bringing them there? You see why it's a little bit hypocritical maybe. All right, so it was of no benefit economically, and that led to, I think, to being looked at as repulsive. All right, so here's what slavery looks like. In 1800, here's the total population. You can see the darker colors where there's more population, predominantly along the coast. There's a little bit of population back in here, but here's where it centers. And here's the slaves, the slave population. You can see predominantly where? Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Now, there's not much up here, but there is some. Pennsylvania, New York, right, New Jersey. Here it's a little mixed, but the highest concentration is here in the South along the coast. 1850. Look how the population of the United States has grown. Look there and there, in just 50 years. Amazing. And look how the slave population has grown, expanded. So we don't see a measurable amount of slaves up here anymore compared to here. There were still slaves. Oops. So it is almost entirely in the South, but heavier and heavier concentrations here, and then here, and then in what's called the Deep South, down in here, a lot more slaves. Now, what was it that helped slavery to be profitable? The cotton gin. We've talked about this before. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin after seeing a slave struggling with picking out all the seeds from the cotton, because that was very laborious, very hard on the fingers. And so he felt sorry for him and invented this machine to help to get the seeds out of the cotton. But what it did is it made it easier to grow more cotton, because now you got a way to get the seeds out faster, which made getting more slaves profitable to pick the cotton. So Eli Whitney's trying to help the slaves, and essentially he made it more profitable and increased the amount of slavery through the invention of the cotton gin. And you can see how it operates here. You turn the crank, these things sticking up, get the cotton, pull the seeds out. We'll continue talking about slavery on Monday. Read the appropriate pages that I've given to you in your textbook as a review of slavery.